Fredrik and I'm the filmmaker.
And I'm Leilani Farha, and I'm the advocate.
And this is our podcast. We have a podcast, Leilani, and this is season 4.
Incredible.
Yeah, and season 4 kicked off with the amazing Peter S. Goodman from New York Times. I think, Leilani, it's so cool to have a New York Times global economic correspondent in our podcast, and who is on the same page, been looking into the same stories that we've been looking into in our work. So it's really cool, and that's why we decided to bring Peter on for a second half, where he will be talking much more about the pandemic, how the most powerful use the pandemic to be even richer and even greedier.
Exactly.
And you people out there, you should actually go and buy Peter S. Goodman's book. And the title is, Leilani?
The title is Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World.
You can order it online, but remember that one of the crooks in the book is Jeff Bezos from Amazon. So don't buy the book on Amazon. Go to support your local bookshop. I think that's how we should do. And so also bookshops can survive and do better.
Exactly. So Fredrik, what are you up to?
Well, I'm working on a new film, but I can't tell you so much about it now because it's secret.
Secret.
But Push, that old movie, is still being shown around. And actually, as we told you last week, all the COVID restrictions are now lifted in the Nordic countries, and in March I'm going to Mexico because we're going to have the Mexican theatrical release of Push, not only Mexico City but also cities around the country. And so I'm soon into a talk with my distributor and our press agent in Mexico. So you, Leilani, and you listeners, if you have friends in Mexico that you want to know about screenings in Mexico, tell them and send them information. And if they want to organize screening, it's a very good window to do it when we also have some attention in Mexico. And why, Leilani, do you think people want to see Push in Mexico 2 years after the premiere?
Well, financialization is becoming quite an issue in Mexico, not just in Mexico City, actually. I mean, it is obviously a touristed country, so you can expect a certain amount of financialization from that, but it's gone much beyond that. In fact, a group of young journalists and researchers have pulled together a very interesting report, so maybe we should have them on Pushback Talks in time for the Mexican release of Push.
I think we must do that. So that's cool. So I mean, it's cool. Will you come to Mexico? It would be cool if you could, but if you can't,
I'm gonna try, but I don't know.
You will be there anyway. You will fly over
on the screens.
You will be on the screens and the very big screens. So,
welcome, Peter.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's talk about the pandemic. The pandemic, of course, in Push, we talk a lot about the global financial crisis, the effect, and what it led to, like a new global landlord coming up. So the financialization of housing, it's something that happened a few years after the big crisis. So Blackstone entered in 2012. So we have been in this podcast, we started in the pandemic, and we said, this is a new moment in history, and now we should all look out. We should learn from the financial crisis, because the Obama government kind of promoted Blackstone in some ways. But now there's a new historic moment. So what is happening now? Are the governments doing it better now?
You mean in terms of the pandemic?
Or in terms of not letting even more power over to the already richest people on the planet?
Some good has come of the pandemic in that, in Europe in particular, there's been a step back from these crippling policies of austerity that have been really just brutal for ordinary people in many countries. The European Union has, softened its budget rules, and it's allowed countries in crisis to exceed the usual debt targets, though, none of that's permanent. And eventually we'll probably be back to a place where austerity rules. In the States, Biden comes in and has all sorts of important proposals on taxation. At some point, flirts with a wealth tax, though he's actually generally not favored a wealth tax. I argue in the book a wealth tax is absolutely, vital because, take Jeff Bezos, who, if we're just taxing income, which is what we do, is going to end up paying a lot less a share of his income than the people who are scrubbing his toilet, right? I mean, here's a guy who makes $83,000 a year on paper. That's his salary at Amazon. That's about what a public school teacher in California makes. Well, the reality, of course, is he's worth $200 billion because he's paid in stock. And we don't tax stock unless it's sold. And even then, we pay it at much lower rates than most people pay income taxes because that's called a capital gains. So Biden comes in. He wants to fund a much more expansive social safety net, which is something that we really need in the United States. And he wants to pay for it by increasing corporate taxes back to a sort of middle level between where Trump lowered them and where they've historically been. And he wants to tax wealthy people. These go absolutely nowhere. We have gotten nothing in the United States. And it's a similar picture. I mean, in the UK, there's a conversation about increasing corporate taxes that seems healthy. But by and large, the pandemic has enhanced the inequalities that have been there all along. And the biggest, most profound failure, I think, we have to look at vaccine distribution policy, right? Where classic, Davos man construction, like we can either have the status quo, we're a handful of well-connected pharmaceutical companies, vacuum up all the profits, and monopolize the fruits of publicly financed research while creating more billionaires in pharma, or we get no vaccines at all. And so what we've got is a situation where Pfizer and Moderna, thank goodness that they gave us these miraculous COVID vaccines. They've done an enormous amount of good. But we are living in a world where large numbers of people in places like Africa, South Asia, continue to be unprotected. Even frontline medical workers are unprotected while we're giving booster shots to children in the United States. And the result of that is not only the predictable humanitarian catastrophe of literally hundreds of millions of people still being in harm's way, but even if you're just selfishly wanting to resume your life in New York or Los Angeles or Toronto or wherever, we've got the Omicron variant. How did we get the Omicron variant? We got it because despite epidemiologists warning us, if we don't vaccinate everybody, it's an open invitation for variants to take root and spread. Well, here we are. We are effectively, in the United States, subsidizing the monopoly royalties of pharmaceutical companies that have a huge and powerful lobby, the pharma lobby, and we're subsidizing them through shuttered schools and the disrupted educations of young people, continued fear, death, overwhelmed hospitals, nurses and doctors stuck in harm's way, threats to livelihood. That's like the way we're paying the freight for pharmaceutical companies to perpetuate a status quo in which most of humanity is unprotected. So that's, if you're looking for signs that our system is learning some lessons and is able to meet the basic needs of human beings on Earth, the pandemic's a pretty big test, and we've failed.
And because these companies don't even pay taxes. We have this amazing American-Italian economist, Mariana Mazzucato. She is pointing out exactly what you say here, that a lot of the inventions that are used in medicine or technology are actually state-funded or publicly funded. But then they send very little back to society in taxes because they don't see themselves as a part of any country. They see them as a global tribe that is flying over everything with a lot of different passports in their pockets.
And they tell you a variant of the cosmic lie, right? Which is if you regulate them, if you force them to pay taxes, if you threaten their monopoly on their intellectual property, then we'll all die. Like, Davos man gets paid or we all die. We won't have any innovation. I mean, we heard all these arguments surrounding AIDS drugs, in the 90s. And boy, these companies have made plenty of money even after they were forced to share their intellectual property. I mean, none of the pharma executives are sleeping under overpasses.
Leilani, you've seen a lot of people sleeping on overpasses.
Yeah, too many people. I think in your book, the stuff about Pfizer and Pfizer, overcharging governments. I mean, overcharging is just not even the right word. I mean, just extracting so much wealth from these vaccines. And the scene you portray, which was news to me, about them pressuring the U.S. government to roll out boosters when the science wasn't there yet that boosters would be useful. For me, it keeps coming back to their incredible political power and their power to change the world, really. I mean, pushing for boosters when the science wasn't there. Now, maybe they were right in the end,
right,
and maybe boosters have been useful. But the fact that they can change the course
right,
of medical practice, the fact that they can go to governments and basically pillage from a social welfare state and benefit from a social welfare state, I think is so shocking. I'm wondering, and Fredrik, I hope you don't mind, but I don't normally ask the questions, but one of the big news stories for me, and I think Fredrik as well, was that Blackstone is actually quite involved in the healthcare industry in the U.S. And maybe you...
I was just
you were going there.
Team
okay.
Health.
There we go.
No, it's
go
great.
for it.
It's great. No, I mean, I never heard about the company Team Health. Had you?
No, not at all.
So, Peter, what is Team Health?
Team Health is one of the two largest emergency room staffing companies in the United States. It's a company that sends doctors, nurses, other medical professionals into emergency rooms, along with another company that's owned by another private equity company. They essentially control 1/3 of all the staff inside American emergency rooms. Blackstone bought Team Health back in 2016 for about $6 billion. And they've been accused of participating in this thing called surprise billing. This is a surprise not of the happy variety. This is like you show up at your hospital thinking that you're covered by your normal medical insurance policy. Now, medical insurance to non-Americans is, bewildering and bizarre to try to explain because no one would have ever developed a healthcare system like we have in the U.S. But you're dealing with generally a private insurance company unless you're dealing with the government insurance for older people, Medicare, or for lower income people, Medicaid. And people show up and they sign the paperwork needed to go get care in the emergency room. And then a few weeks later, they start hearing from collection agents when they get these extraordinary bills for, 4, 5, 8 times as much as Medicare, which is the government program, would ever have charged them. And I discovered that Team Health in particular pioneered this strategy of actually paying their doctors based on the amount of revenue they derive from patients, which is a direct inducement to order up potentially unnecessary tests. I mean, essentially, Blackstone and the other investors who've piled into American healthcare in the run-up to the pandemic have turned healthcare into a business that's really not all that different from, an airline or a fast food chain. Like the customer, the patient is the customer. You want to maximize revenue. The people working in the hospitals are costs to be reduced as much as possible so you can jack up margins. And one of the ways you do that is reduce inventory. So, your airline wants every seat taken so they can charge more for the seats. Well, your healthcare investor like Blackstone wants hospitals full so you can demand more for procedures, for hospital beds. This is why the United States, and the United States is not alone. I mean, I detail this in the book. This same story plays out in Italy, in Sweden. The U.S. loses 1/3 of its hospital beds in the 20 years running up to the pandemic. The U.S. turns more and more to just-in-time inventory management for tests, for protective gear. And so this is why the pandemic deals the healthcare system just a tragic blow. Now, the pandemic would have overwhelmed many a system, but I talked to people who told me the story of Ming Lin, who's an emergency room doctor who had worked near a hospital, at a hospital near the World Trade Center in New York during 9/11. So he's now working at the time of this story in Bellingham, Washington, north of Seattle. He's working in an emergency room He's actually an employee of Team Health, the Blackstone company. And early in the pandemic, he starts asking some pertinent questions. He starts asking the hospital administrators, how come the people greeting patients aren't wearing masks? Why do we have no triage system for people showing symptoms of COVID? Hey, why are we continuing to allow people to come in for elective surgeries, elective procedures at a time when we should be worrying about the spread of COVID? And what he's told again and again is, hey, the people coming in for elective surgeries, that's our bread and butter. We make money off of that. We don't want to frighten them with face masks. We don't want to hassle patients. We don't want inconvenience. And let's just sort of, get through this and sweep it under the rug. When he complains to his supervisors, he's told, listen, the hospitals are client. We can't alienate them. What they say goes. He eventually goes public. He goes to Facebook and starts essentially blowing the whistle that his employer is complicit in making the entire American healthcare system vulnerable, and he's fired. Now, Blackstone says he's not fired. They offered to put him somewhere else. There's always a story, right? Like, this guy's got a family. He's got kids in school in Bellingham, Washington. He's not just going to up and move somewhere else. Moreover, why are they moving him? I mean, this guy's valued by his colleagues. He's been there for more than 10 years. And, his supervisor actually says, you've embarrassed the company. You've damaged our relationship with the hospital. This guy's a whistleblower who should be celebrated as a hero. And yet in the structure that we've accepted, created by Davos man, where healthcare is now a business, no, he's, a malcontent who's jeopardizing the business model.
You are listening to Pushback Talks. If you like what you hear, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. Want to support the podcast further? Become a patron by going to patreon.com/pushbacktalks. For more information on the right to housing and Push the Film, visit maketheshift.org.
It's scary, Leilani. That part of the book was a lot of things that I had never heard about. It's interesting that you also look into Italy, which is then a more traditional European economy, but also Italy has been, and also my own country, Sweden, has been adopting a part of this business reality in healthcare.
I mean, Sweden is a special tragedy. Italy, briefly, the province of Lombardy, which is the wealthiest part of Italy, right? This is where Milan is, high-end manufacturers. I mean, these are truly wealthy, comfortable people who have made money over centuries by making things the rest of the world wants. And Milan, of course, is the financial center. And the pandemic just overwhelms this healthcare system because it turns out in the quarter century before the pandemic, Lombardy embraces this notion that privatization will make us more efficient. And so the result is Lombardy's got all kinds of world-class facilities for heart surgery. That's a big one. Cancer, they're just world-class. And yet they don't have any basic healthcare providers. So I talked to a woman who had just taken over a practice from a retiring general practitioner, and she's dealing with COVID. She doesn't even have time to call her patients at the end of the day. There's so many cases. There's no monitoring. You have a system where formerly a truly national or a provincial level healthcare system has a bunch of institutions that can talk to one another. Well, now there's all these contractors at the table. I talked to a woman named Chiara Lapora, who's a doctor with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. And this is a woman who's, spent her life in Afghanistan, Yemen, Cambodia, conflict zones. And she's shocked to discover that her own country, Lombardy, is now a conflict zone. And she and a bunch of her MSF colleagues set up a unit in a hospital in a place called Lodi, where, she discovers that she can't even set up a system where they can control who's coming in and out of the hospital because there's so many private contractors handling the bed linens, handling the delivery of the meals. And they're all saying, well, we'll be in breach of contract if we don't show up according to our schedule. So the pandemic's, spreading there. And there simply aren't enough facilities. And also Italy listened to the McKinseys of the world and shut down hospital rooms in the name of greater efficiency. Sweden is the most tragic case of all, if you ask me, because, here's a formerly world-class, it's still a world-class medical system, but they have essentially downgraded it in order to finance tax cuts to prevent the next Ingemar Kamprad, the founder of IKEA, who famously, leaves to get out from under the high taxation that's required to finance Sweden's, really generous social safety net. They reduce taxation of wealthy people. That goes along with some privatization of senior services, a diminution of senior services and hospital services. So when the pandemic comes in, aided by a kind of crackpot state epidemiologist who decides that Sweden's going to buck the trend of lockdowns and is going to let people wander around freely without wearing face masks.
We love him.
Yeah,
so we love the crackpot man. Yeah.
That allows the virus to spread. But what then happens is, I spoke to people doctors who normally treat patients in senior homes, who told me flat out that there were directives in Stockholm. If you're living in a senior center where this thing spread like wildfire, and you have COVID symptoms, you will de facto, this is the word that doctors use, these are not my words, you will be euthanized. They will put you on a morphine drip, they will cut fluids, and it's lights out. They're not taking you to a hospital because they understood, and I spoke to people in hospitals who told me the same thing, we just don't have enough capacity to deal with this. We don't have enough ventilators, we don't have enough beds, and we're gonna have to make some decisions about who's gonna live and who's gonna die. So if you're in a senior home and you've got symptoms, we're not bringing you to a hospital, we're not even gonna check you out in many cases, we're just gonna say, that's it for you. And meanwhile, I spoke to nurses inside these privatized senior homes who have no masks, who have no instructions, who have been, their jobs have been downgraded over decades based on these tax cuts and cuts to social services.
And they're not full-time staff.
They're not full-time staff. It was a horror show in Sweden.
Yeah.
Played out very similarly in Canada, sadly, in terms of the long-term care homes. And precisely because long-term care homes in Canada have been financialized. So the private long-term care homes work exactly as you described. Not enough equipment, not enough staff, temporary staff, no PPE, the protective gear for folks working there.
Meanwhile, the billionaires have doubled their wealth.
Right.
Yep.
That's the story in your book, and that's the story of this podcast. And so, Peter and Leilani, it's kind of a depressing story. So where is the light? My film, I would say the light lies in understanding things and getting a language to talk about things. So in some way, the light lies also in a New York Times correspondent writing this book, because I can feel that you're kind of angry.
Yeah, I appreciate your saying that, actually, because I think the light lies in us waking up as a society to what's been done to our democratic institutions. And, a lot of people read my stories. I wrote a story about what happened in senior care homes in Sweden, or the privatization in Italy. Oh, that's so sad. I just feel so sad. Of course it's sad. It's a heartbreak that, I spoke to a woman who lost both of her parents in the same care home in Stockholm. She wasn't even able to say goodbye, to her mother. She could see it happening, and she was, yes, it's sad, but more than sad, it's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous that the world's wealthiest people have used this pandemic to profiteer, to add to their wealth, while they're actually telling us that they're saving us, and even telling us, back to Mark Benioff, who I find particularly interesting, the CEO of Salesforce, who goes on television in April of 2020 and says, well, the thing about the virus is we're all one. It's unified us as one humanity, uniquely vulnerable to this coronavirus. And, he says it's erased the illusion of our borders. By the way, I heard from a Salesforce employee the other day who pointed out that Salesforce actually does a lot of business with ICE, the part of Homeland Security that defends the not illusory border. And Benioff, of course, is giving us this whole kumbaya, magic carpet ride to one humanity speech from, I can't remember if it was his $28 million home overlooking San Francisco Bay, or his oceanfront home on the big island of Hawaii, or maybe on a sailboat where he tweets pictures of himself with Lars Ulrich, the drummer for Metallica. The idea that we're all one is belied by the simplest observation about who's delivering the packages, who's emptying the bedpans, who has to go work in a slaughterhouse, who works in an Amazon slaughterhouse where they have to choose between eviction if they lose their paycheck or putting themselves in harm's way. So I think outrage is part of our solution here. It is not going to be easy to take on the apparatus that is Davos Man to reclaim our democracies and overcome the money that Davos Man is capable of, and Davos Man has just unbelievable resources. Amazon actually released they produced themselves a bunch of television spots depicting all of the wonderful ways they were protecting their warehouse employees with interviews with happy warehouse workers. And they sent these out to American television stations that aired them as their own segments. The apparatus is formidable, but we've been here before. We stared down the robber barons in the 1920s. After the Great Depression, we got the New Deal in the US. We got a tremendous social safety net in the UK. The Nordic model's been built up over years. We have a template where you can take on monopolists with antitrust enforcement. You can build up the power of labor. And by the way, stakeholder capitalism, they talk about labor, but they don't talk about labor unions. And you have to increase the power of labor unions. And if we can do those things, if we can bring back progressive taxation, antitrust enforcement, and it's absolutely vital that we boost labor power so labor can bargain for its piece of the action, we could solve an awful lot of problems. Again, that's a simple prescription, not at all simple in terms of execution, but that's what we got to do.
And the human rights perspective,
imperative. Leilani. Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say about the light. The book, there were moments actually, Peter, when I cried in your book. Obviously, it's the human stories for me that are the most moving. When I start thinking about people losing jobs and telling their kids they're not going to college and that kind of stuff, it's heartbreaking. But I also laughed my head off. You have a very sharp wit. And,
thank you.
And so there is light in this book because it's the absurdity, it's the outrage that you bring to light, and you do make the reader laugh, at least this reader.
Well, thank you.
In terms of, how do we bring this down, reconstruct, I liked there was a sort of pragmatism at the end where you're like, you know what? We have the tools. We have them. We have to harness them. We have to believe in them. We have to maybe reinvent them for this century and, et cetera. And I think I'm with you on that. I'm actually, as listeners will know, and Fredrik knows, I'm about to release a set of what I'm calling, in a very unsexy way at the moment, human rights directives on the financialization of housing. So a kind of, here are the actors, here are the instruments, here's how it's all unfolding, and here's what we've got to do. Very practical, but using human rights. A lot of what I'm talking about is tax reform.
Right.
Better legislation to protect, in this case, tenants. It could be workers,
right.
So, and I think that's right. I think there's a lot that can actually be done fairly easily if we can get governments to actually re-engage, to pivot. Governments right now are beholden to Davos, man. They're beholden. They're in bed with them. They're facilitating. They work with them. They're chummy. They're friends, etc. And so we need governments to pivot back to people, I think, and to take seriously human well-being. I actually thought the pandemic was going to be the time. And as you say, we've failed. So far, it's a failure. It's a huge failure. It was worse than a failure, actually, in some ways.
It's a tragedy.
But it's a tragedy. It is, yeah.
But it's brought some images that we need to have, into stark relief. Back to the climate change metaphor. This isn't like, hey, look at the model. Look what's happened to a half centimeter, a half a degree Celsius increase. No, this is like, hey, there's floods, folks. Like, we're watching people in boats, hanging on for dear life. And, maybe let's hope that will at least catalyze a serious conversation about how we got here and where we need to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's keep this debate going, and let's keep talking to each other. We actually, Leilani and I talked about, because Push was supposed to be released in the US, and then the pandemic happened, so we never really got the chance to release the film in a real way. It was like on this kind of digital, on a lot of movie theaters around the US. It was on their web pages, you could watch it, but it was like, it's kind of lost in many ways. So we should do something together in New York.
Love to.
A book presentation and a film screening and talk about it.
Be cool.
That'd be wonderful. Count me in.
Yeah.
We should see if they let me into the country. I don't know if it's if it's still possible.
And if they let me out of my country.
These are strange times to contemplate movement.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's look forward to better days.
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
Well, thank you so much for being on Pushback Talks, Peter. It's been amazing, and it's cool that we're on the same page and that we keep learning. That's one of the points of doing this podcast also.
Well, thank you both for your work. I mean, your tremendous work is so important, and I really appreciate your digging into my book. And this has just been a wonderful conversation. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much, Peter. Amazing. Your work is amazing, and I'll be relying on it very much going forward. So thanks. And thanks for coming on to Pushback Talks.
I think also your work is amazing, Leilani.
Agreed.
And your work, Fredrik. There we go. It's we are one. We're using Benioff.
The group hug. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
And so how do we finance our podcast, Leilani?
We are obviously not connected with the right people. How do we fund our podcast? Well, we don't, but we try to by encouraging people to become patrons of Pushback Talks by going to our Patreon account. So you go to patreon.com and you look for Pushback Talks, and you can give us just a few euros a month. Makes a huge difference, and we like supporters.
Yeah, it's being a friend.
That's right.
It's nice with friends. I think it's a cool thing.
That's right.
Anyway, thank you for this. It was amazing, wasn't it?
Fantastic. Great book. Great talk.
So we see you soon again, Leilani.
Looking forward.
Enjoy the Canadian winter.
Thanks, Fredrik.
Thanks. Bye.
Pushback Talks is produced by WG Film. To support the podcast, become a patron by going to patreon.com/pushbacktalks or follow us on social media at make_the shift and push_the film.